The double interpretation technique is a communication strategy that involves interpreting your opponent's words or actions in a way that is favorable to you, in order to avoid being held accountable or to deflect blame. This technique can be useful in situations where you know your opponent is right, but you need to get out of the situation without admitting fault or apologizing. One way to use the double interpretation technique is by saying something like "I understood you differently," and explaining how you interpreted their words or actions in a different way. This allows you to acknowledge that your opponent is right, but also to put a different spin on the situation and deflect blame. For example, if your boss accuses you of being late to a meeting, you might say, "I understood that the meeting was scheduled for next week, not today. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." This allows you to acknowledge that you were late, but also to deflect blame by suggesting that the mistake was due to a misunderstanding rather than your own actions. Another way to use the double interpretation technique is by saying something like "I thought you meant," or "it seemed to me that you said." This allows you to present your interpretation of their words or actions as your honest perception, rather than as a deliberate attempt to deflect blame. For example, if your partner accuses you of forgetting to take out the trash, you might say, "I thought you meant that you would take care of the trash today. I didn't realize it was my turn." This allows you to acknowledge that the trash was not taken out, but also to present your interpretation of the situation as an honest mistake rather than a deliberate oversight. It's important to use the double interpretation technique with caution, as it can be perceived as manipulative or dishonest if used excessively or in inappropriate situations. It's also important to be aware of the potential risks of using this technique, as it may not always be effective in diffusing the situation and may even escalate it further. There is also scientific evidence to support the effectiveness of the double interpretation technique. According to research on social influence and persuasion, people are more likely to accept an explanation or interpretation that is presented as an honest mistake or misunderstanding rather than as a deliberate attempt to deflect blame. This is because people are generally more forgiving of honest mistakes and misunderstandings, and are less likely to view them as malicious or deceitful. One example of the double interpretation technique being used effectively is in a work setting. Imagine that you are a manager and one of your employees makes a mistake that leads to a negative outcome. Instead of immediately assigning blame, you might use the double interpretation technique by saying something like, "I understand that you were trying to do the best you could in the situation, but it seems like there was a misunderstanding about the instructions. Can we work together to figure out what went wrong and come up with a solution?" By using the double interpretation technique, you can defuse the situation and avoid assigning blame, while also showing your employees that you are open to finding solutions and working together to improve. Another example of the double interpretation technique being used effectively is in a personal relationship. Imagine that you and your partner have a disagreement about a household task that was not completed. Instead of immediately getting defensive or assigning blame, you might use the double interpretation technique by saying something like, "I thought you meant that you would take care of the task, but I see now that I misunderstood. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding and I'm willing to help take care of it now." By using the double interpretation technique, you can defuse the situation and avoid assigning blame, while also showing your partner that you are willing to take responsibility and work together to resolve the issue. Overall, the double interpretation technique can be a useful tool in certain situations, but it's important to use it wisely and only in appropriate circumstances. By considering the potential risks and benefits and using the technique in a respectful and non-confrontational manner, you can effectively communicate your message and avoid being held accountable in situations where you are not at fault.